Amen. We sing always kind of a song of the week, and that is kind of what we do on Wednesday night, and then we do it again on Sunday morning. And we chose that one because, of course, Reformation Day is Sunday, or at least Reformation Sunday, and we sing songs from the Reformation. And you'll notice that hymn, the words are dated to 1551, so it's an old song from the Reformation, and it says from the Geneva Psalter, and it is historically attributed to Calvin, who wrote that hymn, but we can't know for sure because he didn't write his name on things like that. He would just write them and give them over to the church to enjoy. And so that song has been with Christians for many, many years, and we ought to be thankful for great songs like that. And it says quite a bit in that song about our King and the one in whom we place our trust and our faith and who reigns. And that's going to be an important theme tonight because as you see, our theme tonight is on repackaged rivals, and you'll notice there materialism, communism, fascism, secularism. We could add a few other isms to that that the 20th century had and cherished and set in opposition at times to the church. We're going to look at a few of those. As I said, we've lived through this era. You know, depending on your age, you lived through maybe more of the 20th century than some of our younger members here who might have only had a few years in the 20th century. But for some of us, we had a quarter of that century or half that, whatever it may be. We lived through it. And so we saw many things that we're going to talk about tonight. And we recognize that the 20th century is often framed in terms of battles of ideologies. I mean, you think about it, as I said, growing up, I remember being really excited about a movie like Rocky IV, you know, where Rocky Balboa is going to take on Dragoff, or, you know, the big Russian. And that wasn't just a boxer versus a boxer, right? To me, as an American kid growing up, that was an American versus a Soviet, right? Which really wasn't just even then mano a mano, right? It was system versus system. It was idea versus idea. And we could point to other movies that had similar themes, Top Gun and so forth, that, you know, were just kind of rousing to us because we recognized it was a battle of ideas. Whatever else might have been going on there, a boxing match or revenge, you know, for a friend or whatever it may have been that's lurking in the storyline, we recognize the setting is something more. It pictures something more, a battle of ideas. And the 20th century is seen as a battle of ideas. In fact, when I was in college, there was a book that came out that we had to read by a man named Francis Fukuyama called The End of History and the Last Man. And Fukuyama's basic argument in that book, if you're not familiar with it, is that with the fall of the Soviet Union, we came to the end of history. He doesn't mean that history doesn't go on in a real sense, events take place, but he means the battle of ideas was done. That the last competitive system to liberal, democratic, capitalist systems had fallen, and that there was no remaining rival to that system. We can come back to that if we want to at the end to think about it. You know, it's amazing how things reemerge, right? We're back to, again, communism being all over the news. And so you see things don't really die because people come back and say, yeah, but we never really tried it, right? So we recognize this. But again, the idea there that Fukuyama was giving us was that the 20th century was the culmination of human history as a battle for ideas and ideologies that had finally resolved itself. And I think we realize part of Solomon's wisdom there in saying the more things stay the same, the more they change, the more things change, the more they stay the same battles reemerge, right? Repackaged, you know, put some lipstick on it and put it back out there and we'll go again. And so we realize that things come back. But again, regardless, we do see the 20th century as an interesting century, a century of progress, almost unparalleled progress. I mean, if you think about from where the average person was in 1900 to where the average person is in 2000, at least in developed countries, it's mind-blowing, right? The difference in the standard of living and so forth. But we also recognize the 20th century was unparalleled in bloodshed. I mean, there is no other century that saw the amount of bloodshed that the 20th century saw. And so it's a really unusual time in history of progress and war. In fact, one scholar basically summed it up and said that the 20th century is defined by 75 years of nearly continuous warfare. From the beginning of World War I to the end of the Cold War, whether it's cold or hot, and sometimes it was cold then hot, hot then cold, sometimes hot and cold. We recognize there was warfare throughout the century, and you can just trace it out. There's almost scarcely any period you can think of that's not dominated by a war somewhere, and I guess that's probably always true in some sense, but where the major powers are at war, whether it be World War I, maybe a brief period after that where there is internal strife in countries like Russia as they're trying to consolidate their new system, which we'll come back to, then World War II, and then Korea, Vietnam. You might say, well, maybe there's some periods in between, but then you've got the Soviets invading places like Afghanistan. I mean, there was near constant aggression or warfare around the world. And the question is why? Well, again, they were wrapped up in these ideologies, right? We're going to Vietnam to protect the South Vietnamese government from the North Vietnamese and kind of this creeping communism that the Soviets were saying, we want to take over the world. And I mean, that was what they were saying. And we have people like Khrushchev, right, who said that if we're not able to do it, we'll convince your children to do it. We'll get your children and we'll win it that way. And so it seemed like a very real threat. We have to remember that. Now, as you think about this, we mentioned 4 ideologies. I want to mention 2 relatively quickly because we've been dealing with them for several weeks. The first being materialism. Materialism is just the idea that what exists is what we can see, touch, feel, smell, right? That sort of thing with our senses. And that really is one of the more extreme views that came out of the Enlightenment, right? Was the idea that everything can be quantified down to science and that there is no room for supernaturalism. Now, we've argued that a lot of the Enlightenment thought was deism, right? The idea that there is a creator God, he created all this, but he walked away from it. And now all that exists is the clock and its movements built into it, the system. But there were more radical views. There was, even within the deist camp, there were deists that were basically borderline atheistic in their sense of that God has abandoned this world and has nothing to do with it. But there was a more radical strain in the Enlightenment that said basically we don't need God at all. We don't need any concept of that. The world is a self-created mechanism that perpetuates itself. It's a clock that came out of nowhere, or a clock that came out of events in history past. We don't need God, and therefore they were what we call atheistic. And so the Enlightenment, that was the group, by the way. In France, we see, let's take over Notre Dame, and let's no longer have it as a Catholic or even remotely Christian place of worship, but make it a temple to reason. We talked about that many weeks ago, that they literally made it a temple of reason. And some of the events that went on there wouldn't be fit to speak about in a church setting. So again, there were always these radical elements of the Enlightenment. And really what we see in the 20th century is just a repackaging of that, just an updated version of that, what was through a lot of my lifetime called the New Atheism, right? The Richard Dawkins and the, I thought about the other, Anthony Flew, during the 20th century, these guys who were trying to present atheism as the scientific argument. And it's rightly been pointed out many times that the really only scientific answer you could give would be like agnosticism, because you could say there's got to be evidence out there I can't know, right? There's got to be evidence beyond my ability to reason, but they doubled down and said, no, there cannot be a God. And it's kind of interesting how cultish their belief system is, because notice what happens when you would all moderate that position. Like when Anthony Flew said, I'm beginning to think there might be evidence of creator. What did people like Richard Dawkins do? They were like, he's lost his mind, right? It wasn't like, well, let's hear your scientific arguments. No, they were like, this guy's a pariah now, right? He's outside the camp. Because again, it's a religious belief. It's just the reality, right? As much as there's a God who created this world, it's as much a religious belief to say there isn't. And you see that in the way that there is a lack of any serious. Richard Dawkins, right? People say, oh, he's the greatest mind in the New Atheist camp. And yet he refuses to debate our greatest minds. Why? Why would a scientist like William Lane Craig, he will not debate him? Why not? Why not? And I think we know the answers. But anyway, But again, all I'm trying to argue here is it's just a repackaging, a modernized packaging of the materialism arguments that we saw in the Enlightenment, and really the same thing with secularism. Secularism is a more complicated one because it's become predominant in the 20th century. To say that there should be something like secularization of our culture. In other words, there needs to be a strict separation between the church and the state. And we would even point to groups like we as Baptists that support that idea. So, we're not necessarily saying it's a bad idea. But I also think it's been repackaged. What's often called secularization today is not what anybody meant before. It's almost like the bait and switch, So what do I mean by that? Well, you hear people talk about secularization. They'll say, well, there is a wall between church and state that cannot be infringed. And what they mean is you can't bring your faith into the public square, right? We can't have prayer at a graduation. We can't have prayer at a sporting event. If you get elected to Congress, you need to let your personal beliefs go to the background because now those are not why we elected you, although they might be why you got elected. We don't know. But regardless, that has nothing to do with what secularization was in the early days, like in the founding of our nation. In fact, what quote often is given is Thomas Jefferson's that there must be a wall built separating church and state, but Jefferson didn't mean what people quote that to mean, right? Jefferson was writing to Christians saying this, arguing on their behalf. In other words, what happened was, I think it was in Rhode Island, there was a group of Baptists that wanted to have a parade, and the city council told them they could not have a parade. This is very early in American history. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in support of the Baptists saying that the government had no right to restrict them from having a public parade. And his argument was there should be a wall of separation between church and state, meaning the church should not be the state should not be interfering with the church, not the other way around. And now everybody uses that quote to say, it's even Thomas Jefferson was saying that, the church should stay out of things in the public eye or whatever. It's not at all what was being argued by our founders. So what I'm saying is there's a bit of a bait and switch in the 20th century to say we've repackaged it to say that whatever your religious beliefs, you got to keep them to yourself, right? They belong in your home, in your church. Leave them out of the public discourse. But that's never what it meant before. And that's not what Baptists ever thought it meant. That's not what anybody ever thought it meant until the 20th century. And so again, there's kind of a repackaging of that in the 20th century that has attempted, I honestly think it's a pretty clever marketing move on the part of the materialists to use it as a cudgel to take any talk of religion out of the public square. But regardless of any of that, that brings us, those things come out of the Enlightenment. We see that and come out of kind of popular responses to that. We've already discussed a lot of that, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that tonight. What I do want to are the two dominant ideologies that we see in the 20th century that we had to wrestle with. Really had to wrestle with. They're not completely new either, but they did set and dominate the 20th century, and that would be communism and fascism. We all... fascism might be a little bit, or at least some of the major expressions of it before our time, but certainly we know that the 20th century had to deal with this. I want to mention communism first because it kind of sprang up first in our kind of popular way of recording history. Marx, of course, existed in the 1800s, and I mentioned before he's an interesting guy. I really do think that. He was trying to wrestle, I mentioned, with alienation. And he had this theory, if you read his early writings, that if a man is forced to sell the product of his labor, he becomes alienated from it. All the old philosophers were worried about this idea of alienation. So the roots of communism is how do we overcome alienation from our work? That's really where it came from. He came up with this complex system that he thought would fix it. That if we all own property jointly as a community, right, as a people, then it lessens the alienation. I don't know that's true. I don't think that's true. In fact, I would say what I want to go a step further and say about Marx is Marx is a really interesting guy in that anybody ever really took him very seriously, because if you get beyond those early philosophical writings, which are interesting, you really get later to systematic writings of how to set up a system, a financial system in Das Kapital and works like that. That is a mess, quite frankly. But regardless, even if you want to get past that and say, well, let's look at the man himself, it's interesting to me that what he is often doing is arguing for something he didn't live by. Now, it's not surprising, right? One of the marks of philosophers are they want to be free from living under the conditions they're preaching to everyone else. And we see that even today. Certainly we see it in his life because when you look at some of the various things, he was upset at the bourgeoisie, the ownership class that owned the means of production. He was very upset at them because they didn't live up to their responsibility to their workers, right? He said they have neglected their workers are not treated fairly, kindly, and therefore they need to be responsible, they need to take care of their workers, and if they won't do that, they ought to be forced to, right? So we'll take over the means of production and we'll take care of it. Well, Marx didn't take care of his own family. Like he's famous for spending all of the money he would get that would come in on himself. He had all kinds of vices and he spent the money on himself, did not take care of his own family. His family lived in poverty, even though he made quite a bit of money and was donated quite a bit of money in his life. Also, he railed against the capitalists for other reasons, like preying on the vulnerable, right? Workers had no ability to defend themselves, and these mean captains of industry preyed on them. Well, he had a maid that was in a very bad situation, right? And he didn't pay her. He wouldn't pay her. For years, he wouldn't pay her. Then impregnated her. And then when it was found out that she was pregnant, made her send her baby off into foster care, would not allow her to keep it, and kept her not paying her for years. So what I'm trying to get at, you can go through, I mean, we could just vilify Marx, but I mean, you just look at the man's life and you just like, if you're looking up the word hypocrite in the dictionary, you could very easily see Karl Marx right there as the picture. But anyway, he loved the fact that his wife was an aristocrat, even though he supposedly hated everything about aristocrats. We could just go on and on and on. But anyway, his ideas live beyond him for 50 years until they finally have a chance to be tried. And so that really happened with the beginning of World War I. So now we're around 1914, and it's not meant to be a history of World War I, so we won't go too much into it, but just simply to say that as those events set off in Europe, it was cataclysmic. When people talk about it still as the Great War, and if there had never been a World War II, we would still probably call it the Great War, because it would seem to have been the greatest war in terms of size, scope, devastation that had ever been fought. And a lot of that was because it was one of those weird things that all the systems that were put in place to avoid warfare sprang and caused greater warfare. So it was a story of alliances getting violated and now other nations having to come in to the battle. So, for instance, Germany, right, is in an alliance with Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, which now means Germany is involved in war against Serbia, right? Well, here's the problem. Serbia had an alliance with Russia. So now Russia is brought into the war because they have a mutual defense treaty. They have to live up to it. Germany also declares war on France, okay? By itself, not a huge deal, except to get to France, they go through Belgium. They violate Belgium's land sovereignty, which now brings Belgium into the war. Belgium says, we didn't give you permission to do that. Well, what's the problem there? Britain has a joint defense treaty with Belgium. So now Britain's brought into this war. So what really began as just a couple of nations squabbling ends up bringing all the major powers of Europe into it. And it's an incredibly devastating war. I mean, if you want to think about just the most difficult war to be in, World War I might have been it because of trench warfare, disease in those trenches, death in those trenches. People were using gases, that had just been discovered, mustard gases and so forth. It was really a horrific war and a deadly war. And Russia was involved in that war, and the Tsar sent millions of troops to go battle against Germany and the Germanic alliance, and it'll be reminiscent of what happens in World War II actually as well. But within 2 years, so from 1914 to 1916, 2.5 million Russian soldiers die. It's a huge number. That's a huge number. And so back at home, people are asking, why are we fighting this battle? Why are we fighting this battle? And it comes down to the fact that they say, well, technically, we're forced to fight this battle because Serbia was attacked and we were in a joint defense treaty with Serbia. And a lot of Russians were beginning to say, don't care so much about Serbia. Why are we in this battle? So there begins to be this movement in Russia, an anti-war movement. And although it's not my point tonight, it's an interesting thing in of itself to look at and see who was using that to kind of plant some seeds of unrest in the country. I think you'll find the old Bolshevik handbook come back to play, but certainly they benefit from it. And there begin to be these strikes during the time of war, strikes within the country. Starts with women's strikes. And then this massive strike comes in 1917, in March of 1917 to Petrograd, major city, important city. Almost all the stuff that's going to the war fronts going through Petrograd. And so this strike stops everything. Everything stops. The war effort is not being sustained. The economy begins to have issues within a couple of days. And Tsar Nicholas has to figure out what he's going to do. Am I going to back down and stop the war effort and appease these people who are striking, or I'm going to tell them, no, we're not going to put up with this? Well, for Nicholas, I really do think he saw, this is one of those things about Russia, right? Russia sees itself as a European power. And Russia sees itself as one of the issues it's often had with Western Europe. Russia sees itself as the natural leader of Europe. Now, you'd have to go back to early church history, medieval church history. We dealt with it a little bit in both those classes, where we talked about Russia as the third Rome. And this is what Russia has always thought of itself. So you had the first Rome, which was Rome, right? The first central point of Christianity that the Catholics would argue and that the Orthodox Church will give them. But then it moved where? Constantinople, right? That's the second Rome. And they said, okay, Constantinople is now the heart of Christianity, which is what the Orthodox Church still argues. So the Catholics say, no, it never left Rome. The Orthodox say, no, it did. It left and it went to Constantinople. And now that is the new Rome. That is the real central place. And then Constantinople falls, right? With the Ottoman invasion and all that sort of thing. And so now the leading place, they argue, was actually in Kiev, but now Moscow is the Russian Orthodox Church. They claim to be the third Rome, the leading Christian hub in the world. And they still argue that, which is why when you see the Orthodox patriarch in Constantinople excommunicate the bishop of Moscow, while the bishop of Moscow says, no, you don't excommunicate me, I excommunicate you, right? They've excommunicated each other a few times through the years because they're arguing over who is truly the top dog, right? And the Russian Orthodox Church argues it's the top dog. And so the reason all this matters is the Tsar wanted to be involved in World War I because he saw himself as the leader of Europe. That's just what he saw himself as. And he didn't feel like it would look good for Russia to sit on the sidelines. But so he tells his army, go to Petrograd, disperse this crowd, disperse this strike, this riot, tell people to return to work, that this is the middle of warfare, this is borderline treason, and if they won't, then do what you need to do. Do what you need to do, make them go back to work. So the army goes there. The army, over the next day, splits. Some people identify with the crowd of protesters. Some stay with the royalist side. You can read in history if you want to. It seems like most of the soldiers that flipped to the crowd side, some of them had family maybe in that crowd. Others, they just didn't want to go to the front lines. Right? It was a meat grinder. I mean, like I said, 2.5 million soldiers in a couple of years. You knew pretty much what your fate was if you went into combat, right? You knew you probably weren't coming back. And so many of them didn't want to go. And they wanted to try to sue for peace with Germany and stay out of the war at that point. Well, at that point, the parliament, the Russian parliament, sides with the protesters. They're feeling the wind, they're feeling the direction shift, and they say, you know what, we're no longer with this war effort either. And so Tsar Nicholas II dissolves parliament, tries to dissolve Parliament, saying he's the king and he'll hold all power. That doesn't go very well. So in a matter of 5 days, from the start of the strikes to 5 days later, things have shifted so dramatically that the Tsar has to abdicate his throne. He basically steps down as Tsar, says that because he knows he's about to be arrested and possibly killed. And a provisional government comes to power. They do get a peace deal with Germany, which both sides violate, but that's neither here nor there. What's interesting is the Germans sent Lenin, who had been exiled to Germany, back to Russia, knowing he'd be a thorn in the Russian side. And Lenin comes back and organizes a small and motley crew to take over the government. And that's exactly what they do. And their tactics are, what's a polite word? Their tactics are not good. They use a lot of tactics we've talked about in these kind of, ironically, in these debates, when they know they're the minority, the most minority party of all the parties at the table. They say, we're just a small party. We've got a small voice. We should be protected. You should not try to push us away from the debates. And then one by one, they pick off their enemies, have them killed, put in prison, whatever it may be. When Lenin kind of gets they never have a majority of support behind them. The Bolsheviks never have a majority support of the Russian people. But when they get enough power, there was a congressional congress that was put together that had been elected to work on a new constitution for Russia. And then Lenin comes along and says, no, we can't trust these people. They're not going to support the workers. They're really capitalists in disguise. So he disbands the Constitutional Congress that had been formed. He arrests certain members of it that were the most able political forces against him. Those people disappear, whether it's to gulags or to be taken outside and shot. And this is the story of Russia for the next however many decades, right? When a leader feels threatened by anybody, those people disappear. And I heard a historian say the other day that in the 1950s, 10% of the Russian population had spent at least some time in a gulag. 10%, 1 out of 10. Think about that. And so that's kind of how Russia was. And Lenin doesn't long survive. He has some health issues, strokes, and so forth. He dies, and there's a question of who will follow after him. His old friend who had been there from the beginning, Trotsky, or this able politician, Stalin. Well, if you know history, you know how that turns out, right? Stalin takes control, saying all the right things, telling everybody how he's going to rule and be fair and open to everybody. He wants people's voices and opinions, and he's a person who can listen to all those things. Meanwhile, the whole time saying that Trotsky can't be trusted. He was fighting the whole time behind Lenin's back. He's a traitor. So Trotsky flees to Mexico City, which you may know this story, writes from Mexico City back to Russia about Stalin and Stalinism, until one day mysteriously Trotsky is killed with a pickaxe in the head in Mexico City, certainly by people that Stalin sent. But that's no different than Stalin did in his own land, right? I mean, if anybody spoke against Stalin, they disappeared. It's just the way it was. In fact, you never saw in World War II the kind of displeasure against the war that you saw in World War I for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Nazis were attacking directly into Russia, into Soviet land. They knew they had to fight against the Nazis. But on top of that, I think it might have been from a movie or something, but there's a line where somebody said, shall we retreat, comrades? And the commanding officer said, in the Soviet army, it's more dangerous to retreat, because if you led a unit in retreat, Stalin would have you killed. That's not what you did. And again, it was a meat grinder. In fact, the Russians have kind of always had that kind of approach to warfare, that meat grinder approach, just keep throwing bodies. And that's why I think a lot of people in the West are surprised at all the deaths in the current conflict with Ukraine. And Russia just fights wars differently than we do. They just keep throwing bodies. And so that's what they've kind of always done. But anyway, when you look at this Soviet ideology, the question is, how does the church come into this? Well, most of us who lived through it, we know, lived through it that history, and I didn't live through Sovietism, but we lived through the history. We know that they don't allow rivals, right? That's what we see. I mean, again, the idea of Stalinism is if you think anybody is even a possible threat to you, not they are a threat to you. It's like one of those systems. No wonder that system has failed time and again, because when you see an able young man coming up the chain, you don't say that guy can really help us. You say that guy's a threat to me, right? And so you have him killed, and that's what they would do time and again. Stalin would allow no one who seemed talented and independent to remain alive. He would get rid of them because, again, to him they were a threat. And you see that in almost every one of these systems. We can walk through them in just a second. But what was one of the great rivals? Well, in the early days, the royal family. They had been exiled by the provisional government, right? Put up in a palace somewhere in the Urals, I think. And there was still a potent group in the early days of the Bolsheviks who were saying it's not too late to bring the royal family back. So what does Lenin do? Let's kill them. Kill all of them. Kill even the babies, right? Kill them down to the youngest one, because if there's no royal family left, guess what you can't do? Bring him back, right? And that's what he did. Had them all taken out and shot and killed. And so, again, what's the other big rival besides royalty, the royal family? It's the church. The Russian Orthodox Church was the other major factor in the environment, and a strong voice. And so the Soviets were like, I should say the Bolsheviks at that time, they later renamed themselves. But the Bolsheviks said, we can't abide this. We can't abide this. So within just a few years, I don't remember the exact number, 8 or 18 bishops were disappeared. And over 1,000 priests throughout Russia, or the Soviet Union, disappeared. Just disappeared. I mean, some of it was obvious what happened to them. People saw them get taken away. Others just in the night disappeared. Walking home, vanished. And anyway, so again, from the very earliest days, the church was a target. And while they never completely banned the church, it's kind of like the Soviets always were clever with these things. Just like in the Soviet Union, they had elections, right? They had elections. But who was allowed to run for office? Members of the Soviet Party, right? So if you were not a member of the Soviet Party, you couldn't run for office, of course, because if you're not a member of the Soviet Party, then you hate workers. And if you hate workers, you're against our revolution. If you're against our revolution, you're a traitor. Why would we ever allow a traitor to run for office, right? No, the only thing fit for a traitor to do is be rounded up, thrown in a gulag, or killed. And that's what they did. So again, there was elections. They just didn't mean anything, right? They had elections all the time. They just didn't mean a whole lot. You were choosing between two committed Soviet leaders and party-approved persons. And so anyway, in the same way, they didn't get rid of the Orthodox Church, but it was known, be very careful what you say. Just like in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, right? You didn't criticize policy. If you criticized Saddam, you ended up in Uday, whatever his brother's name was, in their palace where the tigers and lions were, That's kind of how it was in the Soviet days. A priest that criticized Stalin or later Khrushchev, bad things happened. It wasn't good for you. It wasn't good for your family. And people knew that, so they were careful what they said. We see this all over the world today where there are state Christian churches, like in China. What you're allowed to say is very limited. But again, those churches are there. It said many years ago when Billy Graham went into the Eastern Bloc and he preached at some of those churches. I think it's an exiled Eastern church leader said to him, he said, Reverend Graham, he said, you were just preaching to KGB people. Like they filled the church with KGB people. And he said, well, I figured that's probably true, but I figured they needed the gospel too, which is true. But these are generally the hardened believers, right? But still preach to them. I've got no problem with that. But just recognize that, when they invited him to come into these countries to preach, they weren't just putting common people in those pews to hear what he had to say. And so that was one of the things that we saw. And that animus or animosity toward the church was true in Russia. But you can go to China and see the exact same thing, right? And the Mao Revolution, again, that came kind of out of the weakness of Chinese culture at the end of World War II. You can see it in Vietnam. You can see it in Cuba. You can see it wherever you see communism, Cambodia, wherever you see communism take hold, you see a battle against any opposing power, the church being one of the ones always, any form of religion. And the other thing that you see is widespread murder, right? I mean, it's just widespread murder. I mean, one of the things that we'll say as we turn to fascism is we rightly talk about the evils of fascism, and we rightly talk about the evils of Nazi Germany, and it is unbelievably evil, right? I mean, you only have to watch a documentary on what was done to human beings it's hard to watch. I mean, yet in the 20th century, whatever number you want to use, there's different numbers used. The Nazis murdered 6 million people. They murdered 11 million people. I'll grant you whatever number you want. And what the numbers show us is the communists killed 10 times more. It's estimated that the communists in the 20th century killed between 100 and 160 million people. Now think about that. And I'm not just talking about in warfare. This is elimination of their own people. So for instance, Stalin, one example of this, Stalin says we're seizing all farmland. Seizing all farmland. It no longer belongs to you, it belongs to the state. And people in Ukraine, again, why does Ukraine and Russia have this tension? Ukrainian farmers said, no, we don't think we're going to allow you to take our farmland. It's been in our families for generations. We're not letting you take it. Stalin did not have the military force at that time to go in and take it. So what did he do? He waited for winter and didn't send food. And millions of people starved to death, which was exactly what he expected to happen. Not that much different than some of Mao's activities that, people were telling him these are terrible central plans that you have. The Great Leap Forward, for instance, and Mao's like, no, they'll work. And tens of millions of people starved to death, right? In addition to that, go to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Look at the numbers of people they murdered because they saw him as opposition. And it's not just like the history of communism is not just like a failed idea. It's the history of murder. I mean, it literally is. There's just no defense of it. And when you hear our young people on college campuses calling for let's give communism a try, we're like, give us one example where it even remotely looked positive. Like, what's the best case you can ever give us? They'll say, well, Cuba, if the United States had not interfered with it. Well, look at these men. These men are not the angels you think they are. Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara. Read up on these men, right? These were not good men. And even then, okay, look at all the ones we didn't interfere with. And look how it turned out. It did not turn out well. And even under the greatest of conditions. You look at Soviet Union post-war, a lot of the reasons Americans got real nervous about the Soviet Union was the 5-year plan they had post-World War II worked incredibly well. Their economy rebounded incredibly quickly. And it got a lot of people nervous thinking, man, central planning might actually work. They just kind of got lucky, right? Sometimes you hit the dart. You might not be skilled at darts and you hit the bullseye. And that's what happened. And how do we know that? Look at every 5-year plan before or after. It didn't work. The reason Gorbachev came into power was what? People didn't have food. They would go to the grocery store. They'd wait in line for 3 hours to try to find a roll of toilet paper. Or can we get a chicken breast? There's no chicken breast. What about beans? We're rationing beans. These were in times that things were supposed to be pretty good. And so again, the central planning was a disaster, as it was everywhere. Just look in history. So again, communism is not just an idea that's bad. It is bad. But you can't find an example where it didn't have to be maintained by just endless murder. Let's just call it what it is. It had to be maintained by endless murder. And then you have quotations that are just as shocking. And you look at what communist government do we have in the world today? North Korea, where starvation is a regular byproduct of their poor planning of government. So, we just see this is a bad plan, and it persecuted the church. But one thing we will draw out of that is many stories and examples of brothers and sisters who stood bravely and ministered bravely, and so that's one of the ideologies that we saw play out. The other we already mentioned, fascism, and fascism was. I think you could probably say was also a result, or at least what we think of as those predominant fascist examples in World War II, was probably an outgrowth, right, of the First World War as well, because Germany was crushed, and part of the way to prevent Germany from kind of coming back into power was to control their military, control their economy through making them pay reparations to the other nations that had been devastated by the war. And Germany couldn't afford those. Their economy was in the toilet. They couldn't afford them. It's often said that the United States several times helped them to make their payments. And then what happened in the United States? The Great Depression, right? So there was no more money for the United States to kind of help bail Germany out. So Germany did what governments often do when they've got a financial deadline and no money at all. They just said, turn the printers on, right? Start printing a bunch of cash. And we'll send it to Britain, and we'll send it to France. And they went through a period of hyperinflation, and of course that brought the nation to its knees. And when a nation is brought to its knees, it's looking for hope. And here comes the loudest voice in the room, right, with ideas that he can somehow turn it all around. And so the Nazi Party begins to rise to power, and with a vision of kind of a resurgent pan-Germanism, pan-Germanic nation. And this is the beginning of fascism, and what we would think of there. Now, what's interesting is that word fascism comes from the old Roman bundling axe, which is kind of like a bundle of sticks with an axe blade on it. It was a symbol in the Roman Empire of its authority, its power, and it seems like the Nazis loved to kind of latch onto that old imagery of the Roman Empire. Even the name Kaiser, right, had been in German history, had been kind of a replaying of the idea of Caesar, and so this was another one. And so fascism comes from that idea of old Rome, of power and authority. And what's interesting is we had that imagery on our coins. If you ever go back and look at a mercury dime, on the back of it is that same image of a bundling axe. And so when we had to redesign the dime at the end of World War II and put Roosevelt on it, we were like, let's change the reverse of the coin as well and get rid of that imagery. But it just had been authority throughout the years. Now, of course, after this, it began to be kind of a fascistic power. And so, of course, we wanted to not be associated with that. But, we know this history, right, of this guy that has this idea of going to war against the powers that had defeated them in the past. And how do you summarize a whole nother world war in just a few minutes, right? He goes to war both to the east and to the west. He takes on France first, really wants to take, not first, but he wants to take France. That's a major objective. France falls very quickly, and he thinks, I can go into Russia and take Russia. And it really isn't until the United States enters the war that there's that decisive moment that biographers write about where, he says in a moment where North Africa is starting to get defeated and Rommel is beginning to have to just encounter defeats. I mean, Rommel, his great ace in North Africa in terms of tank warfare. And he comes to that moment where he says, I know I need to make peace now either with the Russians or the Americans. And the problem is neither one will make peace with me, which was true at that point, right? Nobody's going to make peace with Hitler. And so the end was known from that point. It was just delaying it, trying to find a way to either hold Europe proper or whatever. But too many people had died, and there was no way that was going to be resolved except by utterly defeating Nazism. And so along that line, the war continues. Now, why is this an ideology against Christianity? Well, we see it very quickly. The same sorts of ideas that we see in Russia happening in Germany. There is no freedom to speak your mind. There is no freedom to share a difference of opinion. If you were to speak out against Hitler, you'd need to leave the country or you might find yourself in prison. And in fact, we have examples like Bonhoeffer, people like that who, when seen in prison at one point and was asked, "Why are you in here?" He said, "Why are you not in here?" And had made it to freedom in New York and said, "I've got to go back. I can't in good conscience stay here when I know that there is work to be done back there." And that brings us as Christians to a whole other thing because of what Bonhoeffer got involved in. But we recognize there was not freedom in the church. And if you really want to look for parallels, although there's a lot of things that are not parallel between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, there are parallels, right? They're both authoritarian governments. They're both governments where the people at the top say what you can believe, what you can't believe, what you can do, what you cannot do. And in some ways, whatever you want to call these things, left wing, right wing, people have all kinds of descriptions. It's kind of like a circle because they end up meeting somewhere on the other side at the same place in terms of how they govern things. But there's no freedom, right? There's no real freedom. If you are to stand up and say, I stand against the ideas of Nazism, I stand against the ideas of Sovietism in Germany or in Russia and Soviet Union, the result's probably going to be very similar for you. You're going to end up in prison, on trial, maybe executed. In Russia, maybe you're just taken out back and shot, but very similar ends. And the church had to deal with that. How do we deal with that? And you see men like Karl Barth, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, being involved in this idea of the confessing church, of a church that's in some sense underground, but in some sense not fully underground. They were still speaking their minds. They were in grave danger, but they said what they believed. They said we have to stand for the truth of Scripture. And if that puts us at odds with Hitler and the ruling party, if that puts us at odds, you imagine a Russian saying the same thing, puts us in odds with the Soviet government, then so be it. But we have to stand for what we believe. And that brings us to an interesting thing because, we ought to be able to say what we believe, right? We ought to know what we believe. That's part of what we talk about every Sunday is with the thing like a confession in our scriptures. We ought to know what it is we believe. One of the marks of these totalitarian governments, again, you'll hear people say, well, the Soviets are left wing and the Nazis are right wing. I think those distinctions really mean nothing because, again, at the end of the day, they're not that different. You say, well, no, they're totally different because the Soviets were caring about the average person. I mean, I've got some land to sell you if you think that. You show me a place where the government cared about the people. The thing that the Soviet Union had that, every other government had as well, go look at Cuba, right? Look at Cuba. All the regular people of Cuba are struggling to get by. They've got radios that are 40, 50 years old, right? Then go look at the presidential palace, right, where the Castro brothers live. Go look at the means by which they live. Go to the Soviet Union, those in whatever decade you want to look at, let's say the 1970s, and somebody like, your average person goes to the grocery store, they're hoping to find bread. Can I find bread? Can I find enough food to feed my family tonight? You think Brezhnev was eating that way? No, he was sitting inside the Kremlin being served steak, being served whatever he wanted, wine. And that's always the way these systems live out. We see it. The people who dominate the communist system, those people live like kings, and the regular people get poorer and poorer and poorer. And so at some point, these systems are really not all that different. They're just totalitarian systems, and more for me and less for you, and they work that way. And in some ways, for communism, it's a parody of the thing they're supposed to be at war against, right? Which is a few people at the top having everything and everybody else not. But at least in capitalism, if you come up with a great idea, you can be at the top, right? Everybody has that possibility of being at the top. You come up with a great idea. And so again, you see this conflict of ideas and how they affected the church. The other idea that dominated the 20th century, the one that Francis Fukuyama said won, was liberal democracy, right? The idea of liberal democracy. And what he means by that is the liberal part is classical liberal, which means freedom, right? You have freedoms. You have the freedom to vote in your officials. You have certain rights that cannot be taken from you. Totalitarian governments say you have no human rights, right? What I mean, I've got no document that when Stalin sends his people to my door, I can say, wait a minute, you're in violation. He would just take it out of my hands and rip it up, right? Wouldn't matter. Constitution means nothing. Why? He holds all power. He holds all power. Same thing in Nazi Germany. If I had some contract the Nazis made with society, I'm like, wait a minute, look. Right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because the person in power is not restrained by law. That's the difference between a liberal democracy and that. There is law. And so again, as you're wrestling through all this, the idea that Francis Fukuyama had was liberal democracy won. At the end of the day, all the major countries will be liberal democracies, including China, he would have argued. China's taken that middle way, right? Half communist, half capitalist. We're taking the middle approach. He said, they'll get there. They'll get there. I say, put your seatbelts on, we'll see. But regardless, the church went through many of these challenges. These ideologies were very difficult and cost many brothers and sisters. We don't even know their names. We know the names of some. Bonhoeffer was hanged because he was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler, which again, I said that brings us into questions. What can Christians be involved in? Just war? We got to think about all those sort of things. Those are questions not for tonight, but we recognize that what Bonhoeffer said was, this man is the embodiment of evil. And we must take him out, right? So you see these difficult things Christians had to live through, but how many countless Christians do we not know their names, that died, that suffered, that went to gulags because, they wouldn't put away their Bible. They wouldn't say, I renounce my faith. How many people in all over the world? I mean, we're talking about between fascism in its various forms and communism in its various forms. Who knows? 150 million or more people died in the 20th century. That's a pretty big number. And many of those people were Christians, right? Not just caught up in the midst of warfare, not that that's insignificant, but I mean, many of them killed because they were targeted for being Christians. And if we think those days are over just because the end of the Soviet Union, I mean, you turn on your television and we've got brothers and sisters being persecuted all over the world today. So it takes real courage. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of look at those ideas. Obviously, fascism seems to have risen for a short time. Communism's been more of a lasting thing. But again, like I said, it would seem like in my lifetime, you'd think, well, communism's been defeated. But even in our own country, right, you're hearing, well, there's a mayoral candidate right now in New York, right, who's running as a communist. And I think there's a Minneapolis mayor candidate that's a communist. And I think in somewhere, maybe Portland or somewhere, there's a person talking about running that's a well-known communist. And so again, I think Buffalo has a mayor. Buffalo, New York, the mayor is of the Communist Party. So you have an interesting thing where these things seem to go away, and the next thing you know, they're back again. And people think, what's a great idea? Let's take private property away from everybody. Let's own it as a collective, and then nobody will have more than the other person, and everything's going to be great. We'll sit around a campfire and we'll sing together all night long, and we'll all be happy. And, I think what they're really desiring, right, is that little thing that's put in us to desire a world without sin, a world where there isn't greed and there isn't hate and there isn't all these things that cause divisions between us. And the Bible tells us that we'll have that one day. It's just not going to come about through some government that's elected or puts itself in power, and to look forward to that. In the book of Acts, there's that great scene at the end of chapter 2 where it says that they all brought as they had to the apostles and laid it at their feet. And you'll hear sometimes people say that's like communism, and it's not at all like communism. Because this isn't a body of people who voluntarily gave. We do that every Sunday as we bring checks and donate them to the church or to missions. We all voluntarily give of how we've been blessed to bless the work. That's not communism. Communism doesn't give you the option, right? Communism would be much more like if I had the power to go to your work and say to your employer, their checks come to me now. right? And then I'll decide what they get out of their check. Obviously, which one of you would say, that sounds like a good idea? Let me raise my hand and sign up for that. Anyway, so we recognize there's a huge difference between what the book of Acts is showing us and what, and even then, the church has not kept to that throughout its ages. That was a special thing that happened during the age of the apostles, as the Spirit of God led believers to do that. Again, you want to voluntarily give everything you own to some religious cause or some other cause. People are going to let you do that if you want to do that. That's not what communism is. Anyway. All right. Well, I think everything I wanted to cover. You have any questions, comments?